Hey everybody, and good evening. This is John. Obviously we had some technical difficulties with the live stream on Sunday morning, so I'm recording this on Monday night in an attempt. I'm wearing the same clothes because why not? But I want to put together the materials and thoughts that I was trying to convey the other night just so that we can build upon it and get to the next lesson. You'll remember that I started with a recap. And that recap was about the things that we learned in our previous study of the Romans and the early Jesus movement. That study has largely been focused around the idea of power. We've learned basically a couple of things at this point. One is about the Roman idea of power as a concept. You will recall, I think, that the Romans had a number of ways of making sure that power didn't collect too much in the hands of one person. Basically, the whole purpose of the Romans' power system and of their republic was to make sure that power was distributed among 10, 15, 20 noble families, all of whom lived in Rome, with the idea that those noble families had kind of a truce or a peace among them. That was the concept that the state should be run by them and for their benefit, and it shouldn't power should never get too concentrated in the hands of one of them, and in particular in the hands of one man. That was dangerous to the Romans. They did not want a king. In fact, their founding legend about the king Tarquin and his expulsion from Rome it's a fundamental part of their character and of their psyche. The idea that kings are bad and we don't have them and we kick the last one out, and that's kind of our founding legend. So they built up a number of ways of making sure that nobody got too much power. The course of honors, which made sure that everybody had a chance to compete, every noble person had a chance to compete. The regimented military in the form of the Roman legion, which allowed people to compete for honor and power within the ranks of the military, and a variety of other ways in which they made sure that people didn't think too much about collecting a whole bunch of power and ruling over other people. They were extremely proud of the Republic, the idea that even the common man was invested, as long as he was a citizen, with the ability to help participate in the governance of the state. So all of those ideas kind of flow together. And then during our second and third weeks, we talked a lot about the idea that there were a couple of very recent, to our New Testament authors, very recent events in Roman history that had created sort of a shockwave in history. And both of those events, the rise and fall of Julius Caesar, and then the rise and ascendance and final victory of his heir and adopted son, Augustus, who was originally named Octavian Caesar, that those events arose out of the Republic kind of fracturing, right? Decision-making by committee is a wonderful thing, or it can be, but it doesn't create very quick decision-making. It doesn't allow a state or an organization to be nimble and to respond to problems quickly. And at this time, Rome had a lot of problems. It was a republic that had overreached itself and had occupied many foreign territories. There were civil wars and foreign wars and rebellions in far-off places and economic problems, plagues and disasters, none of which the Romans were equipped as a republic to respond to. And so the result of that is that they needed someone to seize power, to be what we would call a unitary executive, a monarch, a king, and to make decisions. And we saw both before Caesar, there was a gentleman named Sulla who contended with Gaius Marius, Caesar's uncle, over control of Rome. And both of them kind of bent the Roman system out of shape in various ways. That desire or need not to distribute power was tested in a number, or not to concentrate power, was tested in a number of ways. Sulla abused the office of dictator. Gaius Marius was elected consul 7 times, although you were only supposed to be able to run once. Consul, again, a kind of president. So the empire, or the republic, was falling apart at the seams. There was too much going on too quickly in too many places for a system like the republic to survive for very long. So it would not have made it without a strong person suddenly seizing power for himself and quickly making the decisions that needed to be made. And that's what happened. Both Caesar and Augustus figured out ways of operating within, of appearing to operate within the system, and at the same time transforming the system so that they became what we think of as an emperor, right? A king. Caesar unsuccessfully, in the sense that he was assassinated, right, and didn't live long after he had gained all of this power. And then Augustus Caesar, through clever decision-making, through use of his uncle's name and his uncle's reputation as a living god, or as being made into a god after his death, and then his denial that he had any power at all, right? He would always say, "I'm just the first man in Rome. I'm not a king." And he seized power with one hand while pushing it away while pushing away recognition with the other. So that's the situation that we find ourselves in just before the New Testament. Both of these things would have been incredibly apparent and incredibly obvious and part of the story of the New Testament to our authors. And that's not always apparent to us. I think that one of the biggest traps that we get into when we read the New Testament is that we sit down and we read it, and the status quo, the presence of the Romans, the presence of the Jewish Sanhedrin, which is the ruling council, their cozy relationship with the Romans, the presence of Herod as a kind of client or puppet king of the Romans. All of that stuff to us, because we're reading it 2,000 years later, seems like it is very much set in stone, like it's been that way for a while, and will continue to be that way for a while unless something happens. But that's not the case. Pompey Magnus, who he was the Roman general who occupied Jerusalem in 63 BC. You'll remember he was a rival of Julius Caesar, a friend and then a rival of Julius Caesar, who was later killed by allies of Caesar in Egypt. But he conquered Jerusalem, and then everything that we've talked about, the rise and fall of Julius Caesar, the rise the rise of Augustus Caesar and the expansion of the Roman Empire, and the beginning of the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace, all of that begins, all of that stuff happens in the 60 or so years between the occupation of Jerusalem in 63 BC and the birth of Christ in 4 or 6 BC. We don't know exactly when Christ was born, but it was probably between 6 and 4 BC. So within the space of 50 or 60 years, all of these enormous changes have happened. That seems counterintuitive to us when we sit down and read the New Testament, where it seems like everything's set in stone. If you understand that, if you can understand that like a whole lot happened in just a very short period of time, then you can understand why Christ's presence within the Holy Land and his message, why people are thinking of it as a revolutionary message. If you've been ruled by the same people for 400 or 500 years, or 600 years, or 1,000 years, or even 100 years, that can get to seem like a permanent situation. It can get to seem like something that you just got to live with, and that's okay. And you do the best you can. And the Romans are very strong, no doubt. The Jews would have been very aware of this. But if somebody's only been ruling your land for, a couple generations, a generation, and you don't like it, well, that seems like a situation you can change, maybe. So you can understand why Jerusalem, during the time of Christ's advent, when he was on earth, is a powder keg. Right? It's a powder keg because the message that he is bringing, which is in opposition to Rome, it's pointing at Rome and saying the real kingdom is the opposite of this opulence and the tyranny that you see. It's the opposite of Rome. You can see why the Romans might not have liked that, right? And faced with a successive wave of rebellions and poor relationships with the Jewish, the occupied people, and faced with a message that their system is wrong, you can see why they would not want to accept Christ's message or allow that to be spoken, because they're always on a knife's edge, right? There's always going to be rebellion in the land at this time because they haven't been ruling for very long, and the Jews still think maybe we can get out of this. These guys are pretty new; they're newbies in our territory, and maybe, just maybe, a rebellion movement that's situated in the hill country of Galilee or wherever can resist them successfully and drive them out, because they've got other fish to fry, right? They just had like 3 civil wars and a bunch of foreign wars, and they're spread all over the place, and we're small potatoes. Maybe if we fight back, they'll go away, and you can kind of get the sense of why things are so contentious and so problematic, and so everybody seems so fired up. That's because everybody, from the Roman generals who rule from the Antonia fortress to Pontius Pilate, who we'll talk about today, to the Sanhedrin in the form of Caiaphas, the high priest, all of them are on a knife's edge. All of them are about to panic, because at any moment this whole thing could fall apart. And it's happened before. It's happened in the last 60 years. Think about our own time and what 60 years ago looks like. And you will, I think, understand how quickly things can change. I want to talk about Pontius Pilate today. He's probably the most prominent of the Romans that we meet in the New Testament. He is certainly the only one where we get to know his internal thoughts. Well, that's not true. There are a couple of centurions who we hear about, and we'll talk about them as well. But he's the most highly ranked Roman that we meet during Jesus' lifetime, and the only one who directly interacts with Jesus and talks to him. And he's also represented in all 4 gospel accounts, which we're going to turn to in a moment. But first I want to tell you a little bit about him. We don't know a lot about him from extra biblical sources, but we do know a little bit. There are a number of characters in the New Testament, and I call them characters not because they weren't real, but because they are part of a constructed story that's designed to tell us something, right? The storyteller or the writer is using this real historical person as a character in a story to tell us about whatever he wants to tell us about. In this case, the good news about Jesus. So don't get offended when I use the word character. So Pilate is, of all the characters in the New Testament who are Romans, we know not much about him from extra biblical sources. We know for sure he existed and was real. There is an inscription that they've found inscriptions that are on sealing rings. Some of you may have seen these occasionally, like it was a pretty popular device in the past to have a ring that contained your signature, your seal. And when you wanted to seal a letter, you would pour wax over it and then press your seal into it, and that would people would see it and say, "Oh, this is from Pilate," and break the seal. His suggests that he is a cavalry officer, or was a member of the cavalry, a horseman at some point in his career. It has a symbol associated with the Roman cavalry on it, and they found them in the Holy Land, those seals, so they belong to him or people who worked for him in various places throughout the Holy Land during archaeological digs. And I'm probably showing you one on the screen right now. The other thing we have is a temple in Caesarea Maritima. It's a port city I believe on the Mediterranean, but I'll show you a map and you'll see for yourself. There is a temple to Emperor Tiberius there. Emperor Tiberius was Augustus's successor and his adopted son. Tiberius was the first of the emperors to declare himself a god while he was living. And so there is a temple to Tiberius in Caesarea Maritima, and there's an inscription on it that is. It says that the temple was erected by Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, for the veneration or worship of the Emperor Tiberius. And I'm going to show you that here on this screen right now. So we know these things about him, but we also know a little bit about his arrival as governor of Judea. One thing we can figure out, and it says more about Judea than it says about him. He was a prefect or a procurator. Those are basically the same thing, but they're military ranks. They are temporary, or they are military governors. Territories. For large territories, you would have what is called a proconsul. Remember I said a consul is like a president? Well, that's in Rome. If you get sent outside of the territory, you are called a proconsul. So you could be like the president of Hispania or Spain, or the president of Syria, Palestine, which is where Judea is. But Judea is very small and not very important, or they wouldn't have sent a man like Pontius Pilate there. He's a relatively minor Roman official, and is named. He's the fifth. Remember, I told you they hadn't been there very long. He's only the fifth official to be the Roman governor of Judea. So we have these stories from our old friend Josephus. Josephus is a Roman, who you will recall me mentioning many times, is a Roman general who is also a Jew. And so he's in service to the Romans, but he is really the first historian to take an interest in writing out the history of the Jewish people, especially during these times, and of keeping kind of a contemporary account. He lived a few years after the events recounted in the New Testament, but he wrote a lot about the New Testament period, just before him. And he wrote that Pontius Pilate arrived. He ruled Judea from 26 AD, what we think of as 26 AD to 36 AD. And when he arrived, there are a couple of different things that are actually recounted about him. The first is that he came and he erected shields, or he put up shields in the palace, Herod's palace, which is where he lived, as I believe that's where he lived, I'll correct it on the screen if I'm not right about that. But he entered Herod's palace with shields that contained an image of Caesar, like this. That's not a perfect representation, but it's similar to what we see in other parts of the world where such shields are preserved. So in any event, it had an image on it, which was not allowed in Jerusalem. You were not allowed to carry a graven image of a person or a bird or a thing or a beast or a thing. Right? That's idolatry. And so it wasn't allowed in Jerusalem proper. That actually figures into a story that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Remember when Jesus is in the temple and he says, "Give me a coin," and they flip him a Roman coin that has an image of Caesar. That's a sick burn, he's playing a joke on the priesthood there, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But you were not allowed to carry an image into Jerusalem like that. And so he was immediately confronted by a large group of Jews who said, no, you can't do that. And it's his first encounter with the idea that the Jews were very serious about their religion. They were very serious about their traditions. And he ended up relenting. He ended up taking down the shields and putting them away. On another occasion, a group of Galileans, so people from the same area as Jesus, came to Jerusalem and staged a protest. And he seated soldiers or legionaries amongst the crowd dressed as civilians, and then he killed them. And the Galileans they weren't like bad Jewish, like bad Jews or anything like that. They were completely Orthodox. They were trying to worship their God. And he ended up killing them near the temple precinct, which is forbidden. And finally, that's actually mentioned in the Bible. We'll get to that in just a moment. Finally, there's an event that's recounted by Josephus where Pilate fought with Samaritans or Samaritans. Remember, these are the folks who came from outside of the country during the exile. They're Gentiles, but they lived in the Holy Land and adopted a kind of Yahweh worship. And the Jews really didn't want to have anything to do with them. So they had their own temple, and their temple was up in Samaria. But they purported to worship the same God, and they just mixed it with all kinds of other things. He ended up contending with and slaughtering them. We know, too, and this is important for our New Testament account, that Pilate was a client of a man named Sejanus. And I'm not going to get into a long discourse on this, but Sejanus was he was the commander of the Praetorian Guard, which is the Roman regiment or the Roman group that guards the emperor, and so he was not just a soldier, but also an official in Tiberius's court. Tiberius, towards the end of his life, or even like the middle of it, he became uninterested in ruling, and he went and he lived on an island, and he basically ceded all of, he said, "Sejanus, you're a good guy, you just go ahead and rule for me." And so he had basically given all his power to this official, and Sejanus named Pontius Pilate as governor of Syria, or governor of Judea, as his client, or as like somebody who would then owe him a favor. We've talked about the client/patronage system before, but the idea is that nothing explicit about it, but he's going to do you a favor and then you owe him a favor. And the person who is owed the most favors by the most people is the most powerful. And Sejanus was very powerful. He was assassinated in 33 BC. And that's interesting for reasons that I'll get into as we talk through our accounts of Pilate in the Bible. So let's turn our Bibles to Luke 13. This is really the first mention that we get of Pontius Pilate, and it's interesting because he is mentioned obliquely. Jesus is in the city of Jerusalem, and he is. He is talking to some of the people in the crowd that he's ministering to. And it says, there were present at that season some that told him of the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. Now this is figurative, right? Like Pilate didn't slaughter them and then mix their blood with their sacrifices. It was, they came to do sacrifice. They came to do what they were supposed to do as good Jewish people, to offer a sacrifice at the temple, and Pilate slaughtered them. So that is, sorry, I'm distracted. Just a moment. Okay. And Jesus answering said unto them, suppose ye that these Galileans were sinners above all the Galileans because they suffered such things? I tell you, nay, but except ye repent, ye shall all likewise perish. Or those 18 upon whom the tower in Siloam fell and slew them, think ye that they were sinners above all men that dwelt in Jerusalem? We're not going to unpack any more of this parable, but basically Jesus is saying bad things happen sometimes. Towers fall on people, and tyrants execute and murder people, and that just happens. Life is like that sometimes. That's sort of the point of the story. And he's like, you can't attribute any kind of moral failing to people when these things happen. It's just sometimes it does. But it's an interesting mention of Pilate, right? Because he is portrayed as like this is a current event that's happening right then. Pilate had murdered these Galileans, and it's interesting because you'll notice what Pilate asks a little bit later. So let's turn to Luke 25. We're going to go way deep into Luke 25, I think. Oh no, 22. I'm sorry. We're going to go to Luke 22. And start with verse 66. It says, and as soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests and the scribes came together and led him into their councils, saying, Art thou the Christ? Tell us. And he said unto them, If I tell you, ye will not believe. And if I also ask you, ye will not answer me, nor let me go. Hereafter shall the Son of Man sit on the right hand of the power of God. Then said they all, Art thou then the Son of God? And he said unto them, Will ye say that I am? And they said, What need we any further witness? For we ourselves have heard of his own mouth. So this is loaded with meaning, right? We've talked all the time about how the New Testament really has two fathers. It has Jewish belief, right? And it's very explicitly referenced here, right? Jesus is referencing that story in Daniel chapter 7, where the Ancient of Days, this figure that's like God the Father, gives unto one who is like a son of man authority and power and the ability to rule over the nations. So it's a reference to that. But then he also uses this language where he says he's the Son of God, that's what Caesar calls himself. He's the son of a God. So, chapter 23, verse 1. And the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, saying, Art thou the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, Well, thou sayest it. Then said Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, I find no fault in this man. And they were the more fierce, saying, He stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. Well, that gets his attention, right? And why does it get his attention? Because those people from Galilee hate him, right? They came down there and he murdered them. It says, When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. Reading this account without that information or connecting it back to chapter 13, you might say, well, why does he care? He cares because he's made enemies among the Galileans. It says, and as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, and who we'll talk about next week, who himself also was at Jerusalem at that time. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him. And he hoped to have some miracle done by him, to have seen some miracle done by him. Then he questioned with him in many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod with his men of war set him at naught, and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him again to Pilate. And the same day Pilate and Herod were made friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. So we'll talk about this next week too, but it's an interesting piece of information that we get. And we'll also consider Pilate as a provincial ruler. Herod. And Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, said unto them, Ye have brought this man unto me as one that perverteth the people, and behold, I, having examined him before you, have found no fault in this man touching those things whereof ye accused him. No, nor yet Herod, for I sent you to him, and lo, nothing worthy of death is done unto him. I will therefore chastise him and release him, for of necessity he must release one unto them of the feast. And they cried out all at once, saying, Away with this man, and release unto us Barabbas, who for a certain sedition made in the city, and for murder was cast into prison. Pilate therefore, willing to release Jesus, spake again to them. But they cried, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. And he said unto them the third time, Why, what evil hath he done? I have found no cause of death in him. I will therefore chastise him, and let him go. And they were instant with loud voices, requiring that he might be crucified. And the voices of them and of the chief priests prevailed. And Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they required. And he released unto them him that for sedition and murder was cast into prison, whom they had desired. But he delivered Jesus to their will. So, very dramatic account, and a very good portrait of Pilate. Luke's theme, remember, and you may not have heard this before, but Luke's theme is innocence. You will find again and again and again and again people declaring in Luke that Jesus is innocent, that you should have nothing to do with this innocent man. In fact, the centurion who looks at him on the cross, right, back in Matthew, we have that same centurion looking at Jesus and saying, surely this man was the Son of God. Well, in Luke he says, surely this man is innocent. Right, so that's a common theme, or that's a theme of Luke's throughout the entire text. And so we have Luke, again, using Pilate as an instrument to that, right? Pilate is continually saying, I don't think this guy did anything wrong. He didn't do anything worthy of death, and so I'm not going to have him executed. Which leads to the question, why did he relent? Well, we're going to find out a little bit more when we turn to the Gospel of John, which we will do right now. If you could turn to John chapter 18, verse 28. It says, Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment. Remember, Caiaphas is the chief priest. Interestingly, his reign as chief priest is the exact same as Pilate's reign as governor of Judea. It's the exact same. So that their political fortunes rose and fell together. It says, And it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. So they wouldn't go into a Gentile realm or a Gentile domain on the Passover, because it would defile them ritually. Pilate then went out unto them, which tells you a little bit about his position, right? He has to make these people happy. Or he's going to be in big trouble. He's in the midst. He has a legion of men, 5,000 men under arms in all Judea. That's not a lot, because there's like 1 million Jews there, or more. And it's going to be a real bloodbath if he can't keep the peace. So he went out unto them and said, What accusation bring ye against this man? They answered and said unto him, If he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him up unto thee. Well, if he didn't do anything wrong, we wouldn't have brought him, they said. Then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him, and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled which he spake, signifying what death he should die. So they can't kill him, but the Romans can. And when the Romans do, the method that they'll pick is crucifixion. Right? Jesus has predicted that he will be crucified. And Isaiah has predicted that the suffering servant will be high and lifted up, which is ironic, right? That's an enthronement idea. And he will be high and lifted up, but it'll be on a cross. Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again, and called Jesus, and said unto him, Art thou the King of the Jews? Jesus answered him, Sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it thee of me? Pilate answered, Am I a Jew? Thine own nation and the chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. Pilate therefore said unto him, Art thou a king then? Jesus answered, Thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. Pilate saith unto him, What is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again unto the Jews, and said unto them, I find in him no fault at all. They really don't know what to do with him. Pilate specifically is like, I've compared it before to like putting a PlayStation game into an Xbox. He's like, I don't know what to do with him. He's not talking sense, but he's not saying anything that I should kill him for. I find in him no fault at all. But ye have a custom that I should release unto you one at the Passover. Will ye therefore that I release unto you the King of the Jews? Then cried they all again, saying, Not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. So we're going to skip down to verse... actually, let's continue to read from 19, verse 1. We're going to have to do this in two chunks, and that's okay. We'll do it over the course of 2 weeks. When Pilate therefore took Jesus, and scourged him. And the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe, and said, Hail, King of the Jews! And they smote him with their hands. Pilate therefore went forth again, and saith unto them, Behold, I bring him forth to you, that ye may know that I find no fault in him. Then came Jesus forth, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate saith unto them, Behold the man. When the chief priests therefore and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto them, Take ye him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. In other words, go do what you want, but I find no fault in him at all. 7. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he was the more afraid. Right? Think of the implications of saying that you're the Son of God in a Roman world. Only there's one Son of God, and his name's Caesar, and he lives in Rome. And went again into the judgment hall, and saith unto Jesus, Whence art thou? But Jesus gave him no answer. Then saith Pilate unto him, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have the power to crucify thee, and have the power to release thee? He's like, come on, man. I can help you. I can make this happen. I can release you, or I can kill you, but you have to help me out. He's playing bad cop. Verse 11, Jesus answered, Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it was given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. And from thenceforth Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth, and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in the Hebrew, Gabbatha. And it was the preparation of the Passover, in about the 6th hour. And he saith unto the Jews, Behold your king. But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto them, Shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. Then delivered he him therefore unto them to be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away. Now, if we were to go on, you would see that there's a sign above Jesus when he's being crucified that says, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." And we've talked before about how that's an anagram for Yahweh, right? It identifies Jesus as God. And the chief priests want to take it down. And Pilate says, no. So Pilate is a very conflicted and conflicting figure in this narrative. He's seeking continually to release Jesus. He's shown to be conflicted, and I don't think it's out of any sense of justice, but he's faced with bad choices on every side, right? There's a contingent that loves Jesus. They gathered at the Passover, or they gathered as he entered into the city and waved palm branches like swords in the air and shook them and shouted his name and acclaimed him as a king. And then you have the chief priests who are like, we don't want this. This is a big problem because Pilate might be weak, but behind Pilate is the whole weight of the Roman Empire. They're not going to put up with this. And they allow us to practice our religion, and they let us do what we want. They listen to us when we say, hey, we don't like images of Caesar hanging around in Jerusalem. Can you take them down? You can work with the Romans, but what comes next you might not be able to work with. And if you prove yourself incapable of working with them, you will find that they are not forgiving. And so that's where they find themselves. And Pilate, for his part, right, he's got to make these people happy because his own position, personal and political and militarily, is precarious. There are a lot of people in Judea and not very many Roman soldiers. So his own personal safety is impacted. But he's also got to please Tiberius. Sejanus, his patron, right, the guy who named him, has been assassinated by this time, probably. And so when the Jews say in in John 19:12, and they say, if you let this man go, you're no friend of Caesar's, that's weighted. That is weighted with a ton of meaning. Remember, the emperor could appear in open court in his role as a senator or consul of the head of the Senate and say, that guy's not my friend. And the next day that guy would kill himself because to be in Caesar's disfavor was to be a pariah. It was to be ejected from society. You were not going to live a good life for very long if you were not Caesar's friend. And so this is weighted with all kinds of political tension. This idea that we're going to go tell Tiberius that you allowed this rebel to live, and you won't be his friend. I think I've run out of time. I'm getting very excited about this. I think this is a good study. So next week we're going to continue. We'll talk a little bit more about Pilate. There are actually 2 more passages about him and about his situation. We're going to go back and unpack that passage with Herod a little bit too, because it's interesting. Jesus usually you can't get him to stop talking, but he doesn't say Herod is the only figure in the whole New Testament who Jesus appears to and has nothing to say to him. It's meaningful. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'll talk to you later. Thank you for your time and attention, and remember to wash your hands and don't touch your face. Thanks.